You are listening to an Unlocked New Models episode.
Less than half of our interviews, discussions, audio dramas, or monologues are ever made public.
To access all of our content or to join the discussions in our Discord server, visit patreon.com/newmodels or newmodels.substack.com.
You're now listening to New Models.
Welcome to New Models. This episode features returning guest Marek Poliks, along with his collaborator Roberto Alonso Trillo, to speak about their new book, Exocapitalism, Economies with Absolutely No Limits, released earlier this month from Becoming Press. Both Marek and Roberto are artists, composers, and theorists working in the expanded universe of machine learning across academic, artistic, and commercial institutional contexts. Marek is based in Minneapolis, and Roberto is based in Hong Kong. Prior to writing Exocapitalism, they co-edited the book Choreomata, Performance and Performativity After AI, published at the end of 2023 by Chapman & Hall, CRC. And they are the creators of the absolutely essential Dis.integrator podcast, which means that if all of the present company were to perish in some violent accident, say being crushed by the weight of a falling interest rate or thrashed and mangled by a flailing supply chain, good podcasts would cease to exist. Exocapitalism is a tricky book. Longtime listeners know that we've been talking about awareness of scale since the beginning, and exocapitalism explicitly addresses scale. In fact, its theorization of capital takes place within such an inhumanly large scale that no matter how hard we try, it's easy to slip into the more human but less relevant scales below. It's worth listening to this episode twice. I gained deeper understanding each time I went through the edit. And once it clicks, exocapitalism opens up what feels like another dimension of capitalism today, like seeing something 2D rendered in 3D for the first time. Marek and Roberto's ideas are as unwieldy as they are urgent, and the book, with illustrations by Avocado Ibuprofen, is rich with examples, serving as an accessible guide. You will never think of Salesforce the same way again. But there is a lot in this conversation to consider and process. It feels like some strange thrill ride that manages the push of high G-force and heavy torque, but at low speed. With that, I'm Lil Internet, joined by my co-host Carly Busta. Our guests are Marek Poliks and Roberto Alonso Trillo, co-authors of the book Exocapitalism, Economies with Absolutely No Limits. Let's get into it.
We're in the studio today with Roberto Alonso Trillo and Marek Poliks of the Dis.integrator pod, and we are so excited to be speaking to them today about the book Exocapitalism, Economies with Absolutely No Limits. They are calling in from Perth, Australia, where they are at an academic conference. Marek, Roberto, welcome back and welcome to New Models.
Thanks so much for having us. Dis.integrator loves New Models forever. I was going to say that you're like our older brother podcast, but I don't want to age you guys because you're so much more beautiful and sprightly and connected to the young people than we are. So it's more just like a spiritual older sibling podcast.
We'll take it though. What do you always say, Julian? Eventually we'll be the people who knew the before time of the internet.
No, we're going to be like the cognitively indigenous by the time we're in our 70s or something.
Right. And they'll put us on a special island or a special Switzerland of like the information space where we'll get a pension for like being like true holders of truth outside of the model.
Just having a like neuronal arrangement that no longer exists.
We'll change our name to ancient models.
Elder models. Elder models,
exactly.
That you can get some real academic funding from that, I'm sure.
That would be great. Well, anyway, so it's afternoon for you. It's morning for us. What are you feeling? Place us.
So we're in Perth. We're at the Politics of Machines conference. I think part of the reason that we're here is Cortical Labs. Do you guys know Cortical Labs by any chance?
No.
No, tell us.
Oh man, Cortical Labs. So they are growing computers.
right.
It's the kind of computer interface. You look at it and it like shows the oxygen level. So these are
wow.
lab-grown neurons that are used for compute. And Roberto and I are really interested in what it means for an AI system to be kind of always learning or like always online. And that means that there has to be some kind of plasticity beyond just initial conditions. Like it has to be able to respond and rewire itself, maybe not axiomatically, but kind of algorithmically in response to real-time things. And like that kind of computer, while it seems kind of scary, it's a good opportunity for like that type of work. So Roberto, do you want to hit them with your take?
I mean, it's just an observation of the space here in Asia. I don't know if it applies like everywhere. But what we sense is that funding within the academic realm for the AI discourse has come to an end, or is coming to an end, to the extent that academia has come to realize that the AI project now belongs to the industry to some extent.
Interesting.
And now there seems to be a focus on neuroscientific research. And the reason that we've identified for this to be happening is that they're looking for a new paradigm. And that paradigm has to come, to some extent, from neuroscientific research again. So they sort of return to the brain as the element that is going to define the future of AI once the current project closes itself as a dead end.
It's, I mean, he was like, AI is dead in Asia as a kind of academic research object, which is like a crazy, crazy thing to hear, but makes a lot of sense because what kind of research can you really do in mainstream academia outside of direct research connections to large corporations that actually impacts AI in like any substantial way? And like the answer is like kind of not a lot.
Right.
So I guess you can do neuroscience research.
So growing computers, of course, I mean, are they human neuron cells grown from these long stem cell lines? Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So they still link back to some like aborted baby from the 70s or something. But literally, I'm not being grotesque on purpose. But of course, then the computers, they die, right?
That's right.
Yeah, they literally die. Yeah.
Yeah. Adds a whole new like apocalyptic element into it because
we could go down an entire rabbit hole on that, and I already want to ask you about analogies between brains and computers, and you know how we can get outside of this maybe 50-year-long understanding of the brain as a kind of computer. But maybe that will happen along the way because you have this book that's out.
But you could also be talking to computationalists right now, and
that's
they're
right.
going to say you're wrong. So
it's also true. So I first want to talk about the book. I mean, we were just saying before we hit record that reading this book feels a little bit like picking up a copy of Deleuze and Guattari's On the Line. It has that kind of like schizo-poetic, that speed to it in a sense, but it also, I mean, you were like...
I think it's the Das Kapital of the 21st century because this framework just feels like universally important and like that you could have Chris Hayes on MSNBC talking about exocapitalism.
Well, it's somewhere between those.
You're going to get a Tucker Carlson invite.
Oh my God, please. That would be a culmination.
That would be wild. I feel like that's completely possible. And I would be a big advocate of that happening.
He's been spitting facts recently.
Yeah, true. I mean, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Sometime last summer, we had Marek on, and we were talking about this idea of lift, which is central to this book. It's just infected everything I think about. It's like Kay Alado McDowell's taxonomy of media and Marek and Roberto's idea of lift feel like these two...
They live glasses.
Exactly. Like everything starts to make much more sense. And I think back to this time last summer when we were stuck in the BWI business district, which is like a completely confounding space for a human individual because you can't really walk it. There's all these hotels. Why are there so many hotels for this small airport that has international in its name, but it honestly only flies to Iceland, maybe London, maybe Puerto Rico? Or does that even count as international? Right.
Yeah.
Bermuda, right, exactly. And I just remember being so grateful for this concept of lift because it made me feel less crazy. The incoherence that I was experiencing was ordered by this idea that this is by design. And so could you guys give us your elevator pitch of this concept of lift?
I'm very happy that the book makes things feel like they make a little bit more sense. People have asked me, like, why would you write a book like this? Like, what's it for? Like, what possibly could you be trying to affect through publishing a pretty arcane book about capitalism in this context? So I'm happy that it resonates in that way. So lift, if you think about the transition from the hardware economy that we used to have, an industrial economy where you have things that are getting constructed and built. And gradually over time, that transformed into what we refer to as the service economy, right? Where it's less about the actual kind of physical construction, and it's rather about finding some way to inject value into those commodities through the presence of some kind of mediating human. That allows you to do all kinds of wacky stuff with labor.
One thing that was really helpful in letting me understand what you mean by lift was looking at the industry that anchored 20th century West, like steel and cars and paper and these kinds of physical commodities, and the transition to Amazon, AWS, Salesforce figures largely in this book.
Yeah.
So what happens in that transition?
Yeah. So the real kind of nice way to think about it is a transition from an industrial economy to a service economy to a financial services economy, which is exactly where we are at this present moment. In a sense, this could be a way of thinking about a translation from hardware to software, where in hardware, there's all these physical dependencies. There's people moving around. There's like big bricks of unmanufactured things that need to get converted into goods. But in software, you don't really have that so much. You're able to actually get goofy. You're able to actually really invent price because software isn't so manifestly or directly connected in its pricing to physical dependencies. But it's not just about the conversion of hardware to software. It's about building this cascading order of abstraction where at a certain point, you're not selling things to people anymore. You're not really selling anything anymore. You're actually just kind of generating capital, like just generating capital by getting really good at looking at random numbers that are scrolling across a ticker and making educated bets based on the patterns that we all understand to be nascently present in random number distributions.
Can you give us a few examples?
Yeah.
One thing I love about your book is that you have so many physical examples. For instance, talking about all the different products that AWS offers, right? And it's just absurd, the list.
Yeah.
Can you give a few examples of what this exocapitalist company looks like?
Yeah, totally. So think about the conversion of Amazon as a physical marketplace to a logistics marketplace to a software space that is hosting the ability for other people to sell their stuff to gradually a software-only marketplace in the form of something like AWS or Amazon Web Services. Think about the Hilton Hotel brand, which has gone from being a physical place where you rented a room to essentially a loyalty points marketplace, right? Think about the airline industry, which has transitioned from moving bodies through spaces through to an industry that's actually losing money as it moves bodies through spaces and is actually much more about collecting on partnerships with companies like American Express, for example, on loyalty points, or is actively engaged in the practice of what's called fuel hedging, where all their pricing is basically about the ability to buy a contract that guarantees the price of fuel at a certain arbitrary point in the future. And that's where all this stuff comes from, is this like incredibly abstract series of dependencies. But it's also not just that. It's like lift is the sense of being lifted away from, right? So like I'm a person and I'm like walking through the world, and all of a sudden all these companies, corporations, whatever that used to provide goods and services down to me aren't interested in that anymore. They're interested in hitting the generate capital forever button, right? Which has nothing to do with me whatsoever. And so I'm left as I kind of like scuttle through an industrial wasteland, or a post-industrial wasteland rather, without any kind of providers of anything. Nothing is really about me anymore. And I feel very small and kind of helpless, right? As this beautiful fractalizing algorithm machine separates away from me. So lift is also this affect or this sensation of being left behind, right? Do you want to situate that within exocapitalism? Maybe exocapitalism is a tricky one.
Yeah. So exocapitalism, I think in a way has to do with this kind of trans-scalar encounter with capitalism. The idea that when we look at it from different perspectives that have to do with human scales, we identify different types of capitalism. We've got so many neologisms that have been applied to capitalism: algorithmic capitalism, surveillance capitalism.
Everyone's making new capitalisms all the time. Yeah.
So the idea here, we're still using neologisms,
we're doing it too.
but we don't think of it that way. What we're trying to identify here is the fact that capitalism is not something we have generated. It's not something that is sociogenic. It has nothing to do with human causality to some extent, but it's something that was there, has always been there as a potentiality, as a virus, as something that works through like algorithmic means, as something that is not necessarily tethered to the human condition or to any physicality of the possibility of, resources, a human space within Earth, but as something that works within its own infrastructure and rules that to some extent are independent to us. So the deep question here, and to us, I think one of the key questions has to do with our ability to make a difference as humans, and to what extent we can articulate that through traditional political means. So when we look at traditional critique, Marxism, and when we explore also, of course, Deleuze and Guattari, and, we discuss Nick Land as well to some extent, and so on, we find this kind of anthropocentric starting point, even if there is an attempt at defining the machinic as something that is universal. And we ask, what if that's not the case? And how can we position our scale within that kind of more complex reality that transcends our ability to act and to modify? The idea of lift is a starting point for that. It kind of explains that relationship that we're establishing with a reality that transcends the human scale and our ability to make a difference.
On the left, usually it's like us against capitalism. That's usually the dyad.
And we're good and capitalism is bad.
Right. We're good. Capitalism is bad. As though also it's something that has always been outside of us, which is untrue. It's something that has been evolving with human activity for thousands of years. But in the book, you make a really good distinction where at this point, exocapitalism, it's not an enemy, it's an indifferent meta process. It's a cancer. Yeah. And it doesn't care about us. And that's kind of where the horror is located. It's not that it's actively trying to infect us. It actually just doesn't care. It's a meta process. And that was a really helpful visualization, thinking about it as a separate layer. You also lay this out in the intro, and I feel like it's worth reiterating here. Part of the reason, as I understand it, that you wrote the book is that you go to a lot of these conferences and you interface with a lot of incredibly intelligent people and people who are influencing the way the state is organizing itself, the way that academic institutions are organizing itself. And you've identified a few things that they just aren't getting. And I know, like, when we started New Models, there were several tenets that I was like, this is founded on the fact that these things aren't getting through. And I feel like if there's a mission to your book, in part, it's trying to convey to the reader that the critical apparatus, and I'm quoting you here more or less or slightly paraphrasing, underestimates the power of the software economy, struggles to articulate the morphological density of digitally realized capitalism, ignores the functional death of labor, and doesn't understand scale. And those are like the four key ways in which we need to have a new understanding in order to find a relationship to it.
I think, let me say something and you can elaborate.
Absolutely.
I think when you look at the critical apparatus, there is an element of truth, or there is something that is being revealed in Deleuze and Guattari, in Baudrillard, Nick Land in the 90s and so on. But I think there is an underpinning sense of incompleteness to the project. Like something is missing. Some of this is not making sense. What we sense is that people are trapped in the beauty of their discourse because it's so well written that you can just use it forever. Everyone is a Deleuzian when you read it. And there is something that was missing. There is a kind of critical realization that the book is trying to convey.
Yeah, totally. One thing that I love about my relationship with Roberto is that Roberto is like very much plugged into academic spaces and is very much aware of that kind of universe and is able to come at it from an outsider perspective and really critique it. And I'm coming from a very different place. Like I do have an academic background, but I'm living in the software economy right now. And I think like what we see in each other's worlds in the academic theory space, like nobody really knows what AWS is. Like they think that Amazon is literally like some giant bulldozer with Bezos at the helm and very kind of justifiably like a trail of blood and bodies behind it. But like that's not what Amazon is. Like Amazon is huge.
No kidding.
Like Amazon is like a fucking world. Like it is a world. And it's a world of dizzying complexity. And there's actually quite a bit of beauty there too. And I mean that in a, let's say, morally neutral sort of way. But I think that the academic community and even para-academic community, let's say theory community, it feels like it's collapsed into this mute critique of there exists big tech, it's American, it's out there, it's single-minded, it's univocal, it has the same ideas about everything, and it needs to be critiqued as this unipolar entity. And it's not that really. It's something a little bit more sophisticated. And moreover, you really do need to know what's inside it in order to critique it. Like, if you've never spun up an AWS orchestration diagram, how possibly can you critique the state of software today? That doesn't make any sense to me. And I don't understand how it's possible for academia to critique techno-capitalism or digital capitalism without actually having done any of that work. And conversely, on my side of the house, there's quite a lot of building going on, but there's not a lot of concurrent meta-analysis. And so, yeah, I think that's something particularly beautiful about this partnership is that we do have both firing at each other all the time. Maybe of the four pillars that you mentioned as being really important to the book, I think the scale one, like, it's an obsession of mine on our podcast. We invite like a super famous philosopher, and at some point I like very clumsily be like, do you have a theory of scale? And almost invariably they say, no, I don't actually. Or they say scale is bad, or they say scale is arbitrary, or scale is random, or it's a mistake to think about scale as, let's say, a hierarchical series of things that contain each other. I feel like the academic theory world, we're kind of stuck in this like post-Karen Barad, Deleuzian, like everything is everything. Everything's kind of like this goopy, ooey gooey mush, and everything is relational and bodies and touching and non-points and nodeless nodes. And like, why am I not allowed to say that like the sun is maybe bigger in some kind of concrete way than a fucking amoeba? Like they're different. Like there's like literally some kind of constitutive difference there that I think matters and really has some salience when it comes to discussing things. So yeah, I feel like now it's turning into a rant, but hopefully this is what.
Yeah, and you say, I love you say that scale is violence. That's a way you put it in the book. The shift in scale can be a kind of violence, and that is something that is maybe one of the most overlooked principles of digital culture, of the way that physical violence plays out. The inability to understand scale is at the root of so much pain and so much confusion. I mean, also just thinking about the shift from linear media to network to neural media, there's also an inability to spatialize
100%.
it, I think causes a lot of our confusion.
And things change very like fundamentally. The same thing at a different scale can generate wildly different externalities and dynamics.
We like to talk about a car, right? Like you can only build a car to a certain size, right? Or it becomes impossible. Like it's not a car anymore. Like it doesn't make any sense. Like the mechanics of a wheel moving a piece of steel, the relationship between mass and the amount of gas required to actually move it forward. Like it's not a car. It transforms into a different thing, or transforms into like a non-thing. Like it transforms into an impossibility.
Right.
Like it's important.
A ripple in a tsunami, it's just all waves, bro.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I was going to say there's some interesting research by like Zachary Orton.
Zachary Orton, for sure. Yeah.
Looking at discontinuities and the human pulsion to reduce everything to scales that become inhabitable and translatable. But that kind of detaches from the broader vision of the complexity of the scaling problem, as we put it in the book. It's a very human-centered way to deal with things. Normalizing scales, coming up with scales that can explain our relationship with the immediate environment, and that they eliminate the possibility of parallel narratives and so on.
Actually, just thinking about like where we are in an academic space right now, with a lot of respect for these spaces, I don't mean to come off as glib. We're AI people in a lot of respects. That's what's actually informing a lot of the book is like the software architecture that goes underneath AI. But people think that they can interact with AI. Like the amount of papers that I read about interaction with AI or interfaces with AI, or like, here's my experience using this particular, shall I name it, Rave autoencoder tool by Earcam. It's this music tool. Everyone loves to talk about it. It's a way that you can kind of really think about yourself in relationship to AI and think that you have some kind of agency with it. You think that you transform it. You're performing with it. You're co-creating. All this co-creativity is really the word. But like AI, that's a scale problem, because like if you think about your interaction with AI, as I open up ChatGPT, I'm pulling up a checkpoint that was saved a while ago, right? That checkpoint is dead. Like it is dead AF. It is categorically non-interactive. And like some people meddled with that corpse a while ago in the form of some kind of human feedback, reinforcement learning. And then it's served up to me via AWS Bedrock, some kind of orchestration layer, maybe directly from OpenAI. It's sharded across all these different servers. It's like this frozen brick of ice. And maybe it's given a tool call. Maybe it's allowed to access a certain website. But when I type in a ChatGPT, I'm giving it a paragraph, and it's literally just finding the next token in its matrix that's associable, most likely in a kind of statistically informed way, with the likeliest output to that paragraph. And then it's taking that, it's adding that to the back of, to the bottom of what I just sent it. And then it's doing it again, and it's doing it again, it's doing it again until it says that it's done. And people love to talk about their interaction with AI, this kind of mutual learning, this co-creation with AI, this ability to like somehow be in a kind of place where you are touching it as much as it's touching you. But that's just not true. The only way that you can interact with OpenAI 4.0 or 04 for that matter is through the activity of hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of people bubbling up into product level decision making that gradually and asynchronously works its way maybe through some kind of human feedback layer that maybe gets printed on some checkpoint later down the line. Is that interaction? Like that's what I mean by an encounter with scale, is this dizzying feeling of like, I would love to think of my relationship with AI as an interaction. I'd love to think of it as something that's reducible to my domain. but it's not. And in fact, the only way that I could touch it is through this incredibly abstract way that involves lots of people, lots of different mechanics. But it can touch me. It sure can.
Yeah, and I think that actually describes a lot of our contemporary experiences. In the book, you have this quote from Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Is that the TV show? Yeah, where like he has like a driverless car and he gets locked out and he tries to call customer service and he just gets put through spirals of different agents who, are following a decision tree and don't actually have the ability to help him until he's spun off into some customer care person and he just pleads for that person to tell him who owns this company or, who is actually the person in power. And there's nobody who's able to say it. And there's this continual deferral of responsibility, authority, agency to the point where code becomes law. Code becomes the authority. This idea that code has become sovereign. And I think sovereign is such a great word to use in this space because of sovereignty coming from this idea of a king who is above all criticisms or requests. And you're talking about this fuzzy space that we increasingly have surrounding us, whether that is getting from the curb to the airplane in an airport, whether that is reaching somebody in customer care about a product you have, whether that is wondering what happens to your dollar when you're paying back your mortgage, whether that is chatting with an AI by any of the large AI companies. You have this idea that you have agency, but ultimately you don't. You don't because code is sovereign. Your book is very much about this kind of space that is increasingly filling our lives. I guess I kind of want to ask what that does to the human subject. When the human subject has the feeling that it has agency, but it doesn't really. And, supposedly these things save us so much time. But as soon as one thing doesn't work, it's incredibly expensive emotionally, time-wise, oftentimes financially. Like, what is our world becoming now that it's being filled with these blocks of, to a human brain, incoherent space that we can't see?
Space that's not for us.
Space that's
it's not for
us.
Like the world isn't for us anymore.
Right.
I'm thinking about like you referenced the It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia episode, which I recommend everyone watching. Not that the latest seasons are necessarily good, but this is like a real banger of an episode. It actually concludes by Dennis actually finding the location of the tech CEO responsible ultimately for all of it. And he goes in and he shoots him. Like that's the conclusion. And it's like a dream and a fantasy, but it's like this incredible, like that's the only kind of expression of agency that he can possibly find, is ultimately kind of drilling all the way to a human avatar. Again, a human avatar for responsibility.
Luigi mode.
I was going to say, let's go Luigi mode. Yeah.
Luigi mode. Yeah. And that's the problem, is that there is no human avatar, right? Like that doesn't exist. Like there is no single human dependency that owns any level of any of this, because that side is also not about us anymore. So to speak to like what the human subject looks like under this, I mean, it's part of the reason that I find the book to be therapeutic is that it disabuses us of this requirement to constantly worry about our agency with respect to the agency that we think that we should have, right? We're trained by all the kind of leftist manuals to like rise up, revolt, and take out that tech CEO. And it's crushing because obviously we feel like we have to do something. Things are bad. Like we have to do something about it, but we're incapable of doing something about it for like really strictly mechanical reasons. And it's not about relieving responsibility. It's rather about communicating that problems like this are actually structural. Like it does mean something about scale that points to this radical, violent disjuncture in possibility with respect to the individual.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, there's something also I think important about agency. I guess in a way, it moves elsewhere in the sense that a more traditional understanding of agency as something that can be traced teleologically from an action into a result vanishes through this new view of scale. So once you cannot trace the result of your action anymore into a kind of teleological endpoint that you're trying to achieve, then you have to rethink what your agency may or may not be, if that's still a way of framing your relationship with environment, if you want.
And this brings us to labor. Like when invariably we get the strong fist of the left back upon us for writing this book, it'll be precisely because of our position vis-a-vis labor, which is that labor, at very least within the kind of context that it's actively discussed, let's say online or within the scope of the book itself, is really powerless. It's powerless because labor, it's operating at the scales that are most proximal to our immediate needs. I mean, real kind of urgent needs, right? And those particular scales categorically don't matter to the random, arbitrary, stochastic hedging and betting that's occurring that's really kind of generating so much capital today. There's like a huge discontinuity there. Like how, if I am a worker at Starbucks, let's talk about Starbucks. I mean, Starbucks is a complicated company, and I very much like shout outs to everyone unionizing at a Starbucks. Like that seems like a very reasonable thing to do. But are you manifestly going to change Starbucks, whose business model is increasingly looking something much more and more like a lessee of intellectual property, and moreover, like a bank, through, let's say, targeted interventions at the lowest possible logistical layer, which is its interface with humans?
Say how. Can you just say some of the ways in which it doesn't operate just your drive-through morning coffee?
Right. So if I think about Starbucks' business model, like, I mean, Starbucks certainly sells coffee. Like, we can all accept the fact that Starbucks sells coffee. But really what they do
syrupy, like
sells powders and syrups.
Exactly. But
coffee derivatives.
Yeah.
Right. Coffee derivatives in many ways.
I mean, very much so. We can build a stack, right? There's a really gnarly and intense supply chain when it comes to coffee production, right? Let's put that really right at the lowest possible level of this stack diagram. So in this particular case, if I wanted to buy coffee, let's say from some execrable location elsewhere within the world where there's all kinds of problematic labor practices, I'm really limited in my ability to price that coffee, because I can make the cost of that coffee only as low as my ability to either work workers to the bone for free, enslave them, or automate that through robotics, which are also expensive and difficult to scale. So I'm really limited by what we call fixed costs, right? And fixed costs are frustrating for capitalism because, like, you can't play around with fixed costs. Like, fixed costs are dependencies. Yeah. So then let's build another layer on top of that, which is the kind of service layer, which is injecting value in an abstract way on top of this coffee-derived product, which involves, let's say, there's people, there's a brand, there's some imagery that's associated with this particular coffee-adjacent
The vibe
drink.
layer.
Yeah, I love that. The vibe layer, exactly. And the vibe layer is relatively useful in some ways. It's also, unfortunately, for the kind of, let's say, libidinal flows of capitalism, it's dependent upon the cost of workers at Starbucks locations. It's depending on the retail operating costs of a Starbucks, property costs, things like that. So you're only kind of able to squeeze so much value through the psychic vibes in order to really make any of that worthwhile. So you have to kind of go higher and higher. So the higher level above that would be to think about Starbucks as only vibes, right? As essentially an image that sits on any kind of number of like mass market consumables that might be associated with that brand. Or it could move into something that you see in a lot of other objects, which is a kind of franchisee model where you're essentially only selling the idea of Starbucks, or in this case, something like Dunkin' Donuts, which does operate more franchise level.
Yeah, which is funny because, I mean, at the end of that chain, Starbucks is a company that sells coffee and makes money out of it without really selling any coffee.
Yeah, it's a tech company.
Yeah. Right,
and it's a
right,
bank
right.
company. Yeah.
Like the coffee is not part of the business.
Yeah.
That's completely relevant to the...
Yeah, that's exactly the point. So like you have that kind of IP layer that sits on top of that, which again has to do with selling the vibe of Starbucks as a thing that maybe someone else can do the dirty work of deploying and dealing with all those nasty dependencies that sit underneath it. And then let's come to the top of our stack, which is, have you used the Starbucks app? Like there's all this kind of entrainment. There's all of these points that are then associated with other things. And that's where you start to get in the strategic partnership universe, where maybe you can buy and sell your Starbucks points in other marketplaces like American Express points, right? You can start to create these abstract relationships between strictly financial entities mediated by these weird tokens. And so like things get more and more financialized as you move to the top. And we think of this movement up to the top as actually kind of a propulsive motion, as everything kind of ultimately wants to become a bank at the end of the day, because banks can make up any price they want. Like it's random. Like it's very much literally random. And it's actually increasingly unchained from raw supply and demand dynamics because there's no fucking consumer anymore. like the consumer is partnership, is some kind of loose secret handshake in a back room. It's like flow of software that maybe contains itself within someone else's software ecosystem. It's super abstract, and you don't have products anymore. You don't have consumers anymore. You just have math, baby.
This gets to something really fundamental to your book. I mean, right, the Marxist idea of like all of capital stems from labor. And also there's this idea of the market increasing efficiency is like something you hear free market proponents saying all the time. But your book suggests that value is based on something entirely different. And I'd like to hear you propose that very fundamental framework of where value and capital comes from.
The opening page of your book.
Yeah, value equals inefficiency, right?
Yeah.
Do you want me to talk about that?
Go for it.
Sure. So yes, Marx, when he's developing this concept of capitalism that he has, is very much based on labor dynamics. It's obviously based on a number of other things as well, but he's a historical materialist. He's living in his place and time, and he's situating capitalism, let's be very clear about it, in the transition from feudal to industrial Europe, right? And that's pretty limiting. That's pretty arbitrary and I think really random in terms of its positioning in history. There's all kinds of other places you could start a history of capitalism. And we like to think of capitalism not as a labor dynamic, because for the reasons that I just said, like labor dynamics are incapable of really describing the present capitalist situation as it is, but rather thinking about it, if we were to start with finance capitalism, what we have today, and kind of retcon it back 10,000 years ago, right? What if actually it's been financial capitalism all the time? And this is something that David Graeber writes about really beautifully in Debt the last 5,000 years. I mean, there's a little bit of the scholarship. And this is the idea that maybe the way that value is constructed is kind of through something like time. I buy a coin or I buy some silver in one location, and I'm going to go to another location and I'm going to sell that silver for some kind of arbitrary token, some currency that is different in some way. Like it has a different kind of matrix of value that underlie its relationship to other things in that location. And like maybe I'm going to start to scale it up. Like maybe I'm going to gradually take a caravan and I'm going to traverse ancient Persia, and I'm just going to move silver from one place to the other and gradually arbitrage the cost of silver in those two locations, because it's random. Like, what the cost of silver is like a random thing. And especially in this particular context, it's not associated with too many dependencies apart from how much silver is in a given location and who's mining it. And so then looking at this idea that maybe value is actually something that's really created from nothing. It's really created just from taking a thing, and that can be a physical underlying asset. That could be a futures contract, which is in some way related to a physical underlying asset, but heavily abstracted from it. Or it could just be a fucking token that's not related to anything at all. And so taking that thing, and then just by waiting, just by letting the kind of quantum eddies of time flow by, it's going to be worth something different. And maybe if I'm really good at math, I can look at, let's say, a particular random number generator, and I can make a really strong bet that it might be worth more if it moves in its constellation of value in a particular way, if it has a certain kind of curve associated with it. So this is where we start to get really, really crazy in a way that I think is really kind of provocative, where we think about volatility here is this kind of passive thing. You have this piece of silver or whatever, and just through time or location or through just physical place, it transforms its relationship to the respective value of other things. What if that's also labor? What if labor is actually a way of injecting volatility into some kind of abstract held asset? Instead of this Marxian consideration of labor as a human being that you're extracting surplus value of, and their energy, their physical sweat and toil is going into that physical thing and making it worth more. That's a nice way of thinking about it. But again, in contemporary financial capitalism, that doesn't make so much sense. It actually kind of makes more sense to go back and think about, let's say, that worker in the Satanic mill as a kind of volatility engine that's basically injecting randomness or kind of semi-predictable array of randomness into an underlying relationship of value that's maybe connecting, let's say, a piece of grain or some kind of physical chair or something like that, and making it kind of unstable in a way that you can capitalize on it by, again, making these kinds of bets. So yeah, it's all about taking finance capitalism, saying we're not in a new stage of capitalism, actually, like not even at all. It's been this the whole time. And actually, in thinking about it this way, it allows us to escape Europe a little bit as the kind of originator of capitalism. It allows us to escape the Industrial Revolution as the originator of capitalism, and allows us to think about things in a much kind of broader way. And maybe Hegel would have liked that. I don't know.
I mean, there's something there, I think, in that shift of labor not framed as value add, but as a form of inserting volatility. Among different ways of approaching this kind of critique of the economies that we're witnessing, there is this distilled version of capitalism where we have this three-part structure that is discussed in the book, where you have buy, hold, and sell. And we discuss this through the idea of arbitrage that has to do with time, with temporality, with time dilation. And that's a space that fits between buying, holding, and selling. And that's where volatility is being inserted.
In the hold,
Yes. Yeah. And that's a kind of very basic description of the system, but I think one that can help us understand what we're actually talking about here.
So I think that makes a lot of sense as a model for how value is created. And I think it's a really important shift as it becomes more confusing to figure out how to value anything. Because if capitalism has evolved beyond the human social layer to become an autonomous alien force, as the idea of exocapitalism suggests, I'm curious how this relates to human-bound currencies, the systems of exchange that allow us to value labor and resources, let alone art and science. There are several possible divergent paths to answering this question, so maybe it's worth exploring a few of them one by one. How does the rise of exocapitalism change the human relationship to the dollar, or euro or pound or yen or franc, etc.? But for many reasons, let's shorthand
$1.
Like $1, right?
€1.
With a dollar. But I think let's use dollar because the USA does feel a bit like ground zero for some of the craziest spikes. But it's not completely. And I think it is also, as you say, a lot of times in academic conferences, they focus on like Bezos in America, and that's actually false.
Yeah.
And just because of our familiarity with what the dollar had been growing up, and now it's easiest for us to talk about it. Under exocapitalism, there is the face value dollar and the financialized dollar. There is the kind of dollar that one uses to buy a bottle of water, although I think it costs more than $1 now, but let's just say it costs $1. And then there is the dollar that pays for a house via an interest-generating mortgage from the local bank that in turn gets extruded into an infinite chain of speculative financial instruments. The dollar that generates what we can maybe shorthand as exodollars, like let's claim that, like exodollars. In your diagnosis, how do you think about money's double life? And will there come a time when there will be a human currency and a fully exocurrency? Maybe we'll cut this, but I tried to write out the process of a dollar becoming an exodollar, right? A person takes out a mortgage from a local bank to pay for a house. Every month, that person pays interest to the bank until the loan is paid off in full. But the bank knows that by bundling that mortgage with several others and selling it to a private investment entity, it can profit off the service fees from the primary customer while freeing up capital to offer more loans. The private investment entity, meanwhile, will take that mortgage-backed security from the bank, combine it with others, and then splice up the aggregated securities into tranches according to risk-return profiles, which it repackages as CDOs or collateralized debt obligations that it can use to create an array of further investment products for tertiary buyers. And in doing so, opens up lots of opportunities for external speculation on the success or failure of these contracts via instruments like credit default swaps and synthetic CDOs. I think that's right. Anyway, it's in this spirit, if not exactly the letter, that this is how a dollar becomes an exodollar. And there's so much more there, but I don't have the vocabulary to speak, but maybe because that vocabulary is not human vocabulary. So
exactly.
So I wonder, are we going to get to a point where we have to have two currencies, a currency that just spins as like exodollars, just generate value off themselves, and then a currency that is bound to a human experience? Or how
but how does this kind of giant inhuman hyper-financialized system of exocapitalism, how does it affect the kind of human scale value of $1?
Right.
I mean, based on what you described about how sick it is to be a bank, why would anyone be anything other than a bank, right? Why would any company be anything other than a bank? And so at a certain point, there becomes a question of like, what entity, as conceived through a kind of exocapitalist interaction, would be interested in providing goods and services to humans, given this dependency on things like fixed costs, the complexity of logistics.
Right.
And that's the question. Like, that's the question of the book is like, what are we going to do? Like at a certain point, all of this stuff is going to get so fast and so small. And this incoherency, to use Daniel Felstead and Jen Leung's word, jankiness, is going to get so extreme that like, what are we going to do? And we have an answer, which is what we see in a lot of really kind of complicated places all over the world. We're coming to this through Silvia Federici, who is the weirdest person that we could possibly reference, who would hate this book and everything that it stands for. But we like completely agree with her. Her critique of Marx is basically that Marx is saying in this transition from a feudal economy to a capitalist economy, there was this moment of primitive dispossession, where things were seized, where things were taken, right? Where in this feudal economy, there's a complex kind of semi-abstract level of remuneration with respect to the vassal or the lord, but that person is a very kind of complicated position with respect to their own sovereignty. And like, we still have that. Like, that's what we have. Like, that's how we deal with social reproduction. That's how we deal with making textiles. That's how we deal with industrial food manufacturing. That's how we deal with fucking coffee. Like, it's all that. Like, that's the answer that we have. It's just like, we are going to use slavery to continue to produce the material means for human social reproduction. That's what we've been doing for a very long time. And that's what we're going to continue to be doing into the near future, unfortunately. Like, that's the only solution that we have, that like, ultimately we go into this place of permanent enslavement for our own social reproduction.
Yeah. Going back to the question of the dollar, I'll try to articulate this as clear as possible. No? One of the things that we discuss in the book is that credit came before barter. It's kind of a foundational move where there's a conversion of the world into this kind of speculative exchange. And the framing that we provide for that to some extent is this idea of tokenization. The idea of the token as something that happens first as a kind of first level process where we can speak about currency, and then moves into a second level that becomes a kind of exchange.
The token that represents another token.
Within exchange. And the idea that falls ends up wrapping all of that into really complex relationships that are difficult to actually understand and explain in a kind of causal way. You know, this is what a dollar may or may not mean. On top of that, what you have is this idea of drag that we haven't discussed yet, that kind of brings us back into the equation in an attempt to embed the human dimension into the exocapital lifting move. So there is all of that complexity going into, you know, what does a dollar actually represent? I don't think there is an easy answer to that. It depends on the scale and the analytical perspective.
Can you talk about drag? Because I think this is really relevant here.
So drag is a counter move to lift in a way. And that's an attempt on the kind of human side to embed ourselves within the exocapital lifting move. And that's something that has been historically channeled through what we frame as Westphalian structures, or we kind of traditionally conceive them as the Westphalian state, and also through the idea of criticism of empire. So it's a counter move to the lifting process, where humans try to embed themselves into this reality while kind of acknowledging that there is nothing we can actually do about it.
Yeah, like drag is the way that food stamps is treated in the United States right now, which is actually ultimately a very kind of speculative and alienated token economy, where direct relationships between the value of a token and any kind of underlying asset are constantly being modulated. And where, in order to actually engage with the food stamps or SNAP system, first of all, you're dealing with a major financial services entity who's being contracted by the government in order to perform these exercises, and obviously using any capital that is associated with those transactions in a highly generative way. And then, of course, is also being funneled through all of this administrative bureaucracy on behalf of the withering remains of the state that we have in the United States. So drag is all about like the state cutting itself open, because it recognizes that exocapitalism loves complexity. It loves like things that don't make sense, right? It loves abstraction. So the state tries to make itself more and more abstract. It tries to kind of like cut holes within its infrastructure that maybe at first glance look like privatization, but actually constitute this weird foamy structure where it's like disemboweling itself and turning itself into a place for exocapital flows and abstract relationships, where you can have this person who is conceivably entering into a relationship to their nation state and leveraging an institution that's designed to give them food. But instead, there's all these holes that have been cut out where that entire relationship is being mediated, not by a clean privatization entry, but actually by multiple contractors that are filling in this space, because that large financial services company that handles things like EBT or SNAP, they're lifting. Like, they don't want to be in touch with this stuff, right? Like, it's annoying. It involves all these dependencies. It's complicated and it's insufficiently volatile. So as they lift, they're going to cut all these little holes underneath them that are going to be replaced with all kinds of weird little contracting agencies, call centers, things like that are kind of filling in that gap. And as all those things start to lift, you just keep building in these smaller holes as they're proximal to the human layer. So that's what drag is just the state cutting itself open and trying to attract the interests of financializing entities. But what you get is this kind of like Alka-Seltzer like fizz that actually really erodes and accelerates everything on the side.
It's a counterforce to lift. And it's also a false belief in the fact that by augmenting the complexity of the mechanisms that relate state to exocapitalism, we are actually stopping it from lifting. So it's a false hope. based on an increasing complexity that turns out to be unnecessary.
So like the gesture is like, we're making cuts in this increasingly abstract system to bring in humans to help us relate it to the people. But really what it's doing is just creating more surfaces to be colonized by other elements of exocapitalism.
Exactly. And they get smaller and smaller, and they leave smaller and smaller holes. And ultimately what you get is just like a kind of dissolving motion. We also see drag as a double entendre. I'm thinking like drag and performativity, and this idea of what we call labor drag, which is a laborer or some kind of contingent of the labor force whose job is actually trying to construct the conditions of their own value generation in real time.
Hustlepreneurs.
They're actively like trying to...
Well, but just lots of white collar work,
Hustlepreneurs is a good
actually.
example.
And also
Just
Literally
HR.
all white collar work.
Yeah.
It's all white collar labor. Like, I think that's literally what it is.
Yeah.
Is that as you're in the middle of this, you're the people that are actually building out the lower levels of, let's say, a financializing company, some company that's trying to become a bank. You recognize like what I'm doing has no direct correlation to the way that this business is actually dealing with things like revenue. I like to think about marketing a lot. Like marketing is really complicated. It's really, really hard to justify marketing ROI because it's random. Like you do a thing, you do some events, you put up some Facebook posts, you spend a lot of money. Like marketing budgets in every company are enormous, like absolutely enormous.
Huge spread.
But actually moving that to something like conversions and moving that closer to the kind of recurring revenue or even kind of speculative revenue that really drives a lot of large companies today is so abstract. Like there's so much distance between those things that you start to build these jobs that are around constructing relationships through which some activity that's kind of pre-given as necessary is actually being, through some graphs and charts and executive presentations, tethered to real ROI and returns. And then you build infrastructure on top of that. So that's like, there's a lot of that kind of motion of just like adding bloat and complexity to an organization by trying to figure out what does any of the stuff that we are doing actually mean in terms of the bottom line of this business?
There's a kind of false belief that by increasing the surface that is being exposed to exocapitalism through the state, you may be able to entrap it in a kind of cleaner and easier way, which is not actually the case. Yeah.
So Robinhood just announced that they are tokenizing American stocks and even in some case tokenizing private companies that don't actually have shares available on the open market, like SpaceX and OpenAI. So they have like $100 million investment in SpaceX, say, and then they split that into tokens and then sell them as kind of the equivalent of stock shares on their Robinhood mobile app. And tokenization of stocks also allows people all over the world to start to speculate on the American stock market. So you end up with this second order of abstraction of shares in a company, which already increasingly just kind of trade like meme coins, especially when it comes to tech stocks. But if we take this idea all the way out, okay, they tokenize all the stocks of the American market. Now everyone can trade and speculate. It just becomes this giant surface for gambling. And I feel like paradoxically, when that level of abstraction is reached, what you have is just a total flood of animal spirit, right? Like market valuation and what are considered like investments actually just being based on like the flow of swarms and attention and content and these very like human oriented things rather than something quantitative or abstract and calculated. So I wonder how you actually think about this element, really kind of the intersection of, say, exocapitalism and human attention. What we imagine now is just the American economy, actually, which makes total sense in the way it's been going. All it becomes is a substrate for speculation and gambling for everyone in the world on their mobile phones.
Yeah, the DraftKings economy, right? Like that's
right.
That's kind of
which probably is what UBI is
to.
going to be. You're just going to be a gambler all day on your phone.
And you'll be limited to about $1,000 a month in terms of revenue return, right? Because it's complicated and because like actually our friend Avocado Ibuprofen shout outs is like working a lot on gambling right now. It's like a creative object. I find that really interesting. I mean, as you know from gambling, the odds you get on very predictable outcomes aren't particularly good, right? So when it comes to leveraging the herd mentalities of humans to make bets, you're not going to get a lot of return on that investment, right? Those become like very, very safe and predictable outcomes. And so that's where It's instead far more interesting, at least for kind of very large financial services entities, which again, I'm talking about as like large, but they're also porous in the same way that big tech is porous. Like, I don't mean to be too hegemonic about them as well. They're porous, they're worlds, they're universes in and of themselves. But it's far more interesting to leverage the entire terrestrial project as a kind of complex hyperdimensional random number generator. And this random number generator is quite sophisticated because its swings are quite limited, but there is a lot of swinging happening. So in the book, we talk about Elena Esposito's research on the kind of hyperstition of the Black-Scholes formula, essentially major proposition in the 20th century that, we could use some stochastic predictive mathematics to look at a random number curve and really kind of make a decision about what the most opportune time to exit or hold position on, let's say, some stock or some derivatives in the future might be. We can look at this curve and literally say, just based on the physical character of this curve, like, this is the best time to sell. Well, what's interesting is that at the time that didn't work very well. But over time, it actually started to work really well. Like, it was a kind of proposition that entered the ambient psyche and started to really kind of materialize itself. And now, we obviously are many stages removed from the more simple origins of that model. We're using things like Garch and ARIMA, like all of these kinds of machine learning adaptations of this. Actually, like, now getting back to materialism in a very weird way, you have a lot of large high-frequency trading firms physically moving their server infrastructure to be as proximal to trading centers. Like, I find that to be very interesting.
The stock exchange moved like 15 years ago to New Jersey so that it could be next to its server farms, right?
Exactly.
It's like an empty shell.
Exactly. So like the goal is to actually kind of really leverage this more sophisticated kind of random number generator that it's maybe better to bet on. So yeah, like the human attention layer is interesting, but it's unfortunately predictable. Like, it would be better to aggregate thousands of different attention layers simultaneously and look at them and maybe make thousands of little micro bets on that.
I don't know if the question there had to do with, to some extent, choosing to engage. No, so when we think about token entropy, we think about lift. And when we think about engagement on a kind of horizontal basis of the human dimension with these mechanisms that I think you're trying to portray as something that is kind of libidinal and impulsive and animal, I think to the extent that we as individuals believe that we are part of something that is larger than ourselves, that we define as capitalism, we want to be part of it by engaging with it. Like, the idea there is, once we realize there is a detachment there and we are not necessary, we can choose not to engage. On the meantime, people in a very libidinal way, very primary way, they're trying to engage because they want to keep tethered to something that is lifting. They want to believe that that's them choosing to do so. And they don't realize that they're just part of a mechanism that is, if you want, stochastic in nature. Like, their contribution is not anything to do with control, causality, or agency, if you want to frame it that way.
But to just kind of bring this home, like, the point about Robinhood is spot on, because like that's exactly what you would expect something like Robinhood to do in this particular framework, is like, let's abstract everything and let's build a full derivatives marketplace for this, and let's build a futures. Like, we can kind of keep this stack going, right?
In a way, this is drag moving from state level to individual level.
Yeah,
it's a more kind of broad horizontal dragging mechanism where everyone as individual is trying to engage with something that is completely distant and alienated in a way.
So this is the last term, the last mile. A few years ago, around COVID, food delivery apps started really being present in Berlin. And suddenly, all of these industries sprung up around it. And now, visibly everywhere in Berlin are all of these South Asian men on bikes. And basically, they first get here through staffing agencies based in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, through this idea that you can study in Berlin and work at the same time. Then they get the student visas from this host of kind of shady private universities that have opened up, owned by a company, you'll love this, called GUS, Global University Systems. And so they own these shitty private universities in Berlin, which can then
but they're
issue
not even
student
actually
visas.
Based in Berlin. The one that I found was
One's
based
Italian,
in Italy.
one's based
so
in the
elsewhere in the
Netherlands.
EU that have maybe more lax regulations. So they're technically studying abroad from an Italian
Berlin.
university in Berlin. So
To get a
that
student
to
visa.
get a German student visa to work here. But those schools are not real schools. I mean, they nominally have courses,
They're
but they're
accredited,
not. They're
but-
accredited by like shadier parts of, I don't know, European
Yes.
academic systems. Right. So they're not actually going to school here.
but they pay to attend the school, and then they get a student visa. Technically, with a student visa, you're only supposed to work 20 hours a week, but the delivery app company does not actually manage hiring the delivery drivers. Instead, there's another kind of business called a courier subcontracting chain that manages the hiring of the drivers and the payroll and removes obligations from the app company.
So it's not German-based.
Then there are people who make accounts with the delivery apps and then rent those accounts to the students so that they can work more than 20 hours a week. Many of the delivery workers live in apartments rented and then subdivided. And so from this single app, all of these other industries, ghost kitchens, student loans in Pakistan, bike rental app companies, where all of the delivery drivers then rent their bikes from another app, right? You have global university systems, you have staffing agencies, you have account rentals, courier subcontracting chains, and finally, all of these human bodies from 5,000 kilometers away are ubiquitously present in the city, all from a single app. I use this as an example of what you expansively call the last mile. And I wonder if you can share your framework for the last mile, what it includes, where it begins and ends.
Yeah, that's an incredible example of both Lyft and the last mile, in that you have this allergy to being the last person, right? To being the person directly in charge of the human bodies. Instead, you want to slide in right on top of that, right? And so you have this kind of like weird game. Is it Jenga? Is that the game that you build the kind of tower on top of? Yeah. So it's like this kind of weird Jenga game, but Jenga is hanging from the ceiling and you're kind of like sticking things right onto the bottom, but you don't want to touch the ground, right? You really don't want to touch the ground. And that simultaneously does two things. The first thing that it does is it yields this kind of upward motion where if you look at the individual trajectory of any of these businesses, they are propelled by the same kind of lifting mechanics where, again, like gradually they're going to want to move from just being a physical lessee of bikes to an app that handles bike management that's subcontracted to somebody else, to maybe an app that's built on top of that, right? So each one of those individual units is going to undergo that process of transformation. And then you have this strange umbilical that's connecting everything, little kind of strings that connects everything all the way to the ground. And by the ground here, I mean the human, the physical, the material commodity layer. And this chain is what we call the last mile. And so the other thing that this lifting mechanic enables, so first there's this, the lifting motion upward, and then it creates this situation of possibility where you can create an endless, infinite chain of deferral so that everything that's lifted is actually not responsible for anything that's actually happening on the ground. You can sufficiently kind of shoehorn relationships with all of these contractors, with state agencies, oftentimes with para-state actors, really looking a lot at sweatshops, for example, that exist on the border between, let's say, Thailand and Myanmar, right? And there's strong ambiguity about who actually is the sovereign possessor of that territory and where you can actually move bodies from one location to the other. And those bodies will not become citizens of that other territory, but will exist precisely in this state of kind of ambiguity so that even they can't be accounted for. Like, you don't know who they are. You don't know necessarily where they come from. They are not afforded any of the protections that they would be afforded in any kind of like nominal Westphalian configuration. They're instead, I mean, very literally enslaved, or at very least, they're victims of very serious structural violence. And so like that last mile is this chain of deferral that creates this condition of ambiguity that allows that stuff to happen today. And what's interesting is that these concentrations of, let's say, para-state, feudal, enslaved little colonies in a real way aren't happening in necessary coordination with the old school imaginations of like, there are certain parts of the world where this happens and there's certain parts of the world where this doesn't happen. Instead, you see this kind of pocketing, right? You see states where civic affiliation becomes really abstract. And like, this is what is going to happen to that non-exocapital dollar, right? These spaces will get bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually we're all going to live there.
Yeah. Ray Garcia uses this term, I mean, although from a radically different perspective, of surplus population.
Yeah.
That's kind of undefined population that does not belong to a state-level system. One of the interesting things from what you were saying is that last mile has been externalized by westernized state models, if you want, and has been hidden for a while. But now there is a metastatic kind of process of growth that makes it apparent. It's always been there.
Yeah.
We just chose not to witness it. And now it becomes apparent and it makes us feel weird. Like, was that always the case? Mm-hmm. I mean, where is this coming from? So now it's shifting in a way that is, I think, quite interesting. Yeah.
And it's precisely these surplus populations, to use the Thierry communist terminology that Ray Brazier is using, that are ultimately the ones who are physically responsible for human social reproduction, for the continued existence of the human species by actually satisfying those needs. So yeah, in this case, delivery drivers that are physically moving food around. Nobody wants to touch that apart from the people all the way at the end of the chain of this last mile of dependencies. This is also like even more manifestly clear in things like the actual food production itself, which is obviously increasingly industrialized and increasingly performed by individuals who are being transplanted and moved from other locations or are coming voluntarily to other locations, but existing in a state of, let's say, sovereign ambiguity.
But also the product itself, when it comes to food, is part of the last mile, right? I think about the very viral American Slices, the generic brand of Kraft singles, which cannot be legally called cheese. It's a processed cheese product, and they just call it American Slices for the product name. And obviously that rings as extremely alien to us, but that's kind of what ends up at the last mile, where some big abstract business involved in food production creates at the last mile. That's kind of what that logic produces, right? I mean, is everything we encounter now, do you consider really just the last mile of this massive exocapitalist system? Like, are we all just living in the last mile?
I mean, we're not there yet. You and I are talking to each other during free times, during the day. So we're not in the last mile yet. We're sitting in the downdrafts of Lyft, and we're gradually going to make our way into the last mile because, like, how do we solve the problem of human social reproduction at the types of scales that are required at the moment? And like, we don't know a way to do that apart from leveraging slavery. And moreover, as we gradually start to, let's say, lose the value of our labor as it becomes increasingly alienated from any kind of real revenue generation, we're going to find ourselves precarious, and we haven't built any kind of infrastructure in order to satisfy some kind of UBI requirement. And here's where, if I was talking to someone like Nick Cernicek or Helen Hester, whose theory I'm very interested in, where there's a question around like, where's automation going to come into play? If I was to take a kind of left accelerationist position, there would be, okay, let's not use slaves, like let's use robots, right? Like robots would be a very reasonable thing to use in this faculty as objects that are ultimately producing the vehicles for us to reproduce ourselves.
Salesforce, which you talk a lot about in the book, actually now is 30 to 50% of the labor of the company is done by AI. So the quintessential Lyft company you use is now half automated, right?
I mean, it's a lifted AF. I think Salesforce is like one of the most interesting possible commercial organizations. I think everyone should study Salesforce. I think everyone should study AWS. I think they're obviously study through my book.
Yes, exactly.
But like that type of automation makes a lot of sense because like that automation is actually increasingly tied to real revenue generation at some very serious scale. But automated industrial farming is unbelievably expensive and requires some kind of significant capital expenditure upfront in order to actually produce something that is never going to return on that investment in any kind of way. And so like, why would anyone actually build a automated system to make food for people if it's not going to return anything? I mean, like, we know the answer. Like the answer is like a totally centralized government that's built entirely on human social reproduction, or like the philanthropic exigencies of some billionaire who decides that this is like a reasonable thing that needs to be done. But it's not going to happen through the internal flows of capitalism as such.
I've been thinking a lot recently about, I put it into a little aphorism, software did not eat the world, the idea of software did. And I was thinking about, you know, back in the late 19th century, early 20th century, kind of Gilded Age, huge rise of industry and railroads in the United States. There was this era of legal formalism to deal with that complexity, where like a quintessential case was, you know, they decided that no, the law could not cap the number of hours it was legal for someone to slave away in a factory because it betrayed the kind of sovereignty of the contract. And eventually the public thought that went too far. And you had this era in the mid-century of legal realism where judges thought, okay, the law is actually supposed to serve society. It has a spirit to the law. It has a purpose. And what it's ultimately made for is serving people and society. And then in the 1980s, you had this return to a kind of legal formalism with like constitutional textualism in the Supreme Court, where the language of the law itself started to be treated as code in the way it started to be imagined now that software and computation existed, right? Law started to be imagined as software. The text of the law started to be imagined as code, as sovereign, and whatever the code is, that's just what your constraints are. And if you can find ways to do something that isn't explicitly prohibited by that text, there's nothing we can do about it. And so that gave rise to things like, the double Irish with a Dutch sandwich, to technically found a company in Northern Ireland which owns the entire IP of your actual company in the United States, with an office of like 5 people in Ireland, and then do some weird thing with profits through the Netherlands going back to North Ireland, right? It's something that just like is so convoluted, and obviously in spirit, like has no reason to be legal, no reason why anyone would ever do that. But with this kind of return of legal formalism and textualism, they're just like, oh, the law doesn't prohibit it. You got us. Yeah. You can just not pay hundreds of billions of dollars in taxes, right? And also in the finance world, right? You had synthetic CDOs squared, but also things like rehypothecation, where someone gives you collateral for a loan, you immediately take that same collateral and use it to get another loan, and they take that collateral and use it to get a loan. So you have the same piece of collateral just in this long chain of generating loans and generating debt, all with a single piece of collateral.
I love the idea of the Signa Group, this like Rene Benko, this Austrian investor who bought all these luxury department stores like KaDeWe in Berlin, and then he separated the retail operation from the landmark real estate.
Oh, yeah.
And then he made the retail operation pay Signa, who the parent company, a super high rent, so that it basically like tanked the retail operation.
Self-vampirized the actual last mile.
Autophagic, flywheel.
The human level.
He ended up, but I mean, Europe, I guess, the company tanked and he ended up declaring bankruptcy, and he was also charged with fraud. And so that ended. And now a Thai company owns these luxury department stores and has a slightly more favorable formulation of the real estate. I don't know. Yeah, apparently it's okay. But yeah, I mean, that's a great example of like just self-eating.
Yeah. But I mentioned this because I wonder what you think is the original sin of exocapitalism.
What are some of the early markers? Like
or what
conditions
what is kind of the zero order condition that allowed this? I mean, I guess you say it's always existed, but
something ramped
not
up.
in this form.
Right.
And I kind of have thought, it's when, times of legal formalism that these things can happen and kind of expand like a cancer. But yeah, what do you imagine as the initial conditions that allowed contemporary exocapitalism to operate the way it does?
Legal textualism is textbook drag, right? Like that's straight up drag, right? In its lack of any kind of enforcement, it's the allowal of the existence of these little pores in order to attract these exocapital flows. Original sin, do you have an idea on the original sin? Do you think it's
first time that?
Yeah, I mean, let's start with the original sin.
Generated value out of nothing. No, that's the kind of starting point. I mean, that's a critique that I think we posed to Nick Land when we engaged with his writings from the 90s and so on. And I think that to some extent is his view of computation as something that is linked to the human dimension.
Yeah.
And the inability to consider that computation can also be seen as a kind of alien mode of thought, if you want, which is something that Luciana Parisi does to some extent. And maybe we're looking at something similar here. One thing is how humans have engaged in tracking mechanisms throughout history. And part of that is the legal framework as a framing mechanism that can be considered as code and something that can be played with if you want. But the ability to detach that kind of human level scale analysis from a broader consideration of capital as something that is separate from that, I think that's what we're trying to propose.
Yeah, I think so the original sin is, as you put it, the first time we created something out of nothing. One of the critiques of the book is that we get quite theological, and to a certain extent, there's almost a kind
That's the level at which this is happening.
Yeah,
it
really is.
Exactly. And so you can think of that as a kind of invitation, right? Like you've opened the door to something that's occurring. The first time that a physical object became addressable through a token might be that original sin. We definitely both believe that computation exists on some kind of transcendental plane. Again, getting quite theological with it, but I think it's just true. I mean, like mathematics and computation do seem like they exist in some alternative space, and our relationship to it has as much to do with invention as it does with discovery. So maybe because I'm in an academic space right now, I have to suppress this. Like academics love to say, oh, you're claiming that something is different. Maybe it's always been this way, right? Like that's like the thing that every academic loves. That's like everyone's Q&A question. And I'm like, part of me wants to say, Obviously, computation at scale accelerates this significantly because we're able to make smaller and more detailed bets on things. Our ability to handle and make and action decisions on randomness has increased considerably. But then the academic Q&A handler in me is like, is the jank that we are currently experiencing substantially different from the jank experienced by, let's say, the worker in the Satanic Mills? Substantially different in some way. And I'm not sure, like, candidly, I don't really know enough about what that experience was like from a human perspective, phenomenologically, anthropologically, I'm not sure. But I do wonder if this sense that we are floating in a kind of jank space, again, using Daniel Felstead and Jen Leung's term, is necessarily that new. And maybe we're actually increasingly coming to an accelerated realization of just how random all this stuff is and has been. Yeah.
And as an extension of this, returning to the what to do about Lift and exocapitalism. I mean, I think about, legal realism coming in response to this period of legal formalism where the letter of the law was all that mattered rather than the spirit. I mean, why are you black-pilled on the possibility of the state returning to a place where it can exert some agency over this system? I mean, to be fair to Europe, we do see these examples of Lift and exocapitalism, but Germany, never adopted the Friedman doctrine, right? Like we don't have the same kind of wild financialization that really caused the social atrophy that we see in the United States. It's obvious that European regulation has done something good because there is still a society here and the food isn't poison, right? So yeah, I'm curious why you're black-pilled on the state being able to intervene.
So I think the way we're framing the state in the book is from the kind of Westphalian perspective, which is, a kind of a recent historical event, if you want, and the failure of what it has come to represent, and a criticism that is based, for example, Habermas and this idea of the legitimation crisis and so on. I think Marek might disagree with me here. There's an element of agency, but there's not the possibility to disengage or to engage. I think one of the things that people might criticize about the book is we are presenting a fact without proposing an alternative. There is an analysis, but there is no alternative way out. To answer your question, I think there might be a way to rearticulate the different relationship with things, which will probably imply disengaging with exocapitalism and finding an alternative way of establishing the kind of human spaces through new forms of relationships. The way we are framing the state, I think, in the book is deeply linked to that project as a kind of legitimating agent, as something that is part of the game and as such is not a viable way out. Like the ability of departing from that game is not built into states as they are currently conceived, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I keep thinking about, I think it was Wagner Conyer who posted on Instagram, and this is not a reflection on you, but the least interesting question that I can be asked is, what do we do about this? What can I do about this, right? That's always that's another academic Q&A question. Not that that's what you're asking. You're asking a great question about the state.
Yeah.
But I think I'm speaking to the question that we're certainly going to get, which is why are you so black-pilled at the end of this? Or rather, why are you refusing to provide any kind of an alternative? I think it's because if we had thought about the solving for the alternative, we never would have published the
Totally.
book. And frankly, we're not political scientists and we're not necessarily capable of speaking to it. But moreover, we were able to escape analysis paralysis by just saying, this is an analysis at the moment. We're able to kind of come to some kind of conclusion because we're not forcing ourselves to come to a solution from it. Maybe that's someone else's job. That being said, the question about the state is a really good one. If you think of this in terms of computation, the kind of states that we have right now are inherited classes, right, from some kind of superclass from the Westphalian model. And they've permuted considerably over time. And if the question is, do I believe that a strong, centrally planned economy might be a really good thing when it comes to human social reproduction? Absolutely. That is a solution that we all kind of understand as an implicit solution. The question is, what does that mean? Yeah. And there are so many sacrifices that come into play there that even I am not necessarily willing to make.
I mean, law essentially is a kind of code space, and it intersects with the code space of exocapitalism. And exocapitalism has contingencies and can move in certain ways depending on law as long as it's enforced. So, I mean, oddly, in Germany, I'm like, my weird move at dinner party is to be like, actually, I love Rhinish capitalism. I think it's great, right? Like these old companies in Europe that will never raise the price. They have zero debt. They operate in cash. They make great products. They really care about something other than share prices, right? So I think there are just other ways through regulation and law to rein some of this stuff in. And yeah, I got the feeling, though, you thought that was outside of it or not possible.
Yeah, I think that's really hard to do. I mean, like, totally sympathetic to that. Obviously, like, all of us are kind of implicitly pro-regulation in a number of different ways. I think the problem is that the approach to regulation often becomes one of creating additional kind of spaces and opportunities for this kind of stuff to happen, right? Like that's what regulation actually looks like.
Regulation, it doesn't work because, back to your initial point, the state doesn't seem to understand the fundamentals of the conditions that we're in. And so they just further complicate old systems. Yeah. What I love about your book is that it is a decoder ring on why things are so weird, as Kevin Munger would say. And that then allows solutions to be emergent. Maybe that's a pat answer, but I do think let's open that up to the masses, even like the AI brains or whatever, and you give a really useful framework that shifts the paradigm about what kind of solutions can even be made. So we have to abruptly leave. This is, I hope, to be continued, maybe even in person in Berlin this fall. An incredible book out from Becoming Press, and we will give shouts out to your book tour, which I'm sure is rolling out over the coming months. You all are awesome. Thank you for doing the work you do. Roberto and Marek, thank you for taking the time this afternoon for you, morning for us to chat.
We love new models. Book. We literally wouldn't exist without new models, for real, for real.
Well, we wouldn't have a framework to work in. Yes. Anyway, enjoy your trip.
Thank you so much.
Ciao. All right.
Thank you for listening to New Models, and thank you to Marek Poliks and Roberto Alonso Trillo for joining us. Exocapitalism, Economies with Absolutely No Limits, is now available from Becoming Press, and we have a feeling it will sell out soon. So head to becoming.press to order your copy. There are Exocapitalism book launch talks in the coming months all over Europe, including here in Berlin at Trust. We'll share more details with you as the dates come closer, and you can follow becoming.press on Instagram for more info. You can find more of Marek and Roberto's work at their respective websites, and if you haven't already, be sure to follow Dis.integrator wherever you listen to podcasts. All links are in the show notes. While editing the episode, I noticed that Marek often used the metaphor of a random number generator for market activity, i.e. companies placing bets on random numbers. I personally was not familiar with the market is just a random number generator theory of economics, so I asked Marek if he could illustrate it a bit more. What he sent actually serves as a nice coda for our conversation, so here it is. Take a look at a trade by Citadel, a massive international hedge fund. In an instant, a very tiny trend in the price of something, anything, appears. A script watches this trend, and simply through the power of a branch of mathematics called stochastics, it can identify the raw probability of that trend continuing. If that probability exceeds 50%, it's a great bet. Do this iteratively at the speed of information, and you literally have a money machine. Something is produced here, and it looks a lot like capital, but it's not really related to the underlying value of an asset. The asset could be anything, and it could be getting more valuable or less valuable, and that asset could be abstracted into a derivative, a future, a meme coin, anything. You could do this by just making bets on a random number generator. A high-frequency trading bot at Citadel is just looking at a number curve. The surplus value being produced here is just being made by time. So what power can labor have on this? You could say labor makes the computers, labor mines the raw materials, labor produces the electricity. But all of these underlying conditions are as abstracted from the value being produced as any underlying asset itself. If we understand capitalism simply through that chain of labor, through this materialist reading of the things we use to make a gambling machine, we're restricting ourselves significantly in our ability to understand what's really going on. So what if we reread the history of capitalism through spontaneous generation? From high-frequency trading in crypto, through black shoals, through ancient currency arbitrage. What if humans are just random number generators that simulate volatility for gambling? That's the thesis of exocapitalism. Thank you, Marek. Up next, we're working on some America Diaries, and we're lining up our fall slate, so more soon. Sending all our best from the land that summer forgot. That's all for now. See you next episode.
Production, mixing, sound, music, and music prompting by Lil Internet. For more, visit our website at newmodels.io. If you're not yet a subscriber, visit patreon.com/newmodels or newmodels.substack.com.
To access hundreds of past New Models episodes and thousands more to come, visit patreon.com/newmodels or newmodels.substack.com.